هذه المدن وبعض المدن المسيحية بالسلاح الكيماوي، حيث أنها الشبكة الآشورية علمت من مراقبيها في سوريا أن نظام الأسد قد يعمل إلى قصف مدن مسيحية قرب دمشق بالسلاح الكيماوي خلال الأيام المقبلة. كما أكد مراقبو الشبكة الآشورية أن هنالك معلومات مؤكدة وموثقة تم تسريبها إلى الجيش الحر مفادها أن قصف المدن المسيحية يأتي في إطار خطة تهدف إلى تشويه صورة المعارضة وخلط أوراق المجتمع الدولي الذي بدأ حازما في تعامله مع نظام بشار الأسد، وخاصة بعد المجزرة الأخيرة التي ارتكبها النظام والتي سقط من جرائها 1360 شهيدا في الإحصائيات الأولى. البارحة استمعنا للمؤتمر الصحفي لبشار الجعفري مندوب نظام الأسد لدى الأمم المتحدة، وللأسف واصل السيد الجعفري محاولته لتضليل الرأي العالمي والإعلام وإطلاق عدد ضخم من الأكاذيب خلال المؤتمر الصحفي. العالم جميعه يدرك أن نظام الأسد هو من يمتلك السلاح الكيماوي، نظام الأسد هو من لديه الخبرة العلمية لصناعة السلاح الكيماوي، هو من لديه القدرة على استخدام السلاح الكيماوي، هو من لديه الرغبة في استخدام السلاح الكيماوي. نذكر بخطاب بشار الأسد رأس النظام الأسدي الذي تحدث في 4/8 وقال بشكل واضح أنه لم يعد يجد من وسيلة للقضاء على الثورة سوى ضرب الحاضنة الاجتماعية ومعاقبتها. قال هذا بكلام صريح على التلفزيون الرسمي السوري. كذب هذا النظام أوصله إلى طريق مسدود، لأن العالم أصبح يدرك كذب النظام. عندما حاول نظام الأسد أن يدعي أن هنالك خنادق حول مدينة المعظمية وفي بعض مناطق ريف دمشق، حتى عندما أرادوا أن يكذبوا الكذبة لم يجيدوها، حيث ادعوا أن هذه البراميل كتب عليها صنع في السعودية، ونحن جميعا نعلم أن المملكة العربية السعودية لا تملك القدرات على تصنيع السلاح الكيماوي. النظام الأسد هو الوحيد الذي يقوم بتصنيع هذا السلاح. فشل نظام الأسد في تحقيق أي انتصار على الثوار، كما أنه فشل في السيطرة على الشعب السوري المنتفض، ولم ينجح إلا في نشر الموت بين أبناء الشعب السوري والدمار في المدن والقرى السورية. البارحة بشار الجعفري تحدث عن معاهدة في أثناء حديثه في مجلس الأمن عن معاهدة حظر استخدام السلاح الكيماوي، متناسيا بشكل كامل أن نظام الأسد هو أحد الأنظمة القليلة في العالم التي ترفض التوقيع على معاهدة حظر السلاح الكيماوي. Let me switch to English. I'll cover some of the points over here, and then we'll take Q&A. سأتحدث باللغة الإنجليزية ومن ثم سنأخذ الأسئلة والأجوبة. We want everybody to be clear on what's happening in Syria for the past 2.5 years. Bashar al-Assad decided to use lethal force, the 13th largest army in the world, against innocent civilians who protested, who asked for the freedom, who asked for the establishment of a democratic and free society in Syria. Bashar believed that he can bring Syrian people into submission, force them into submission, but he has clearly failed to do so. About a year ago, the Assad regime decided to start using chemical weapons against innocent civilians. At this point, and prior to the last attack, the Assad regime have used chemical weapons in 13 well-documented locations. The regime used chemical weapons in Aleppo, in Khan al-Asal, in Saraqib and Idlib. It used chemical weapons in Khalidiyya and Hams. It used it in Adra. And then last Wednesday, the Assad regime decided to use chemical weapons at a larger scale and targeted the eastern and western Ghouta, causing the death of over 1,360 people, causing injuries to anywhere between, on the low end estimate, about 4,000 to 7,000 people. I also want to remind everybody that first responders and medical relief doctors in the area administered 25,000 atropine shots in the area. Otherwise, we would have had a much larger humanitarian crisis at hand. We know that the regime is responsible for these attacks. We have sources within the regime itself who are sympathetic to the revolution, who have given us detailed information on the sequence of events and how the decision to start to use chemical weapons was made, the exact timing these chemical missiles were launched, and the specific areas that they hit. We understand that it is vital to prove the regime's responsibility to the wider world. And to that end, we have collected evidence, samples ourselves, and we made them available to different world governments and to the United Nations. We have supported from the very first days that chemical weapons were used. We've supported and called for UN inspectors to move into Syria, to move freely around the country. And we've always said, let the evidence show whether chemical weapons were used, and more importantly, who used those chemical weapons. And I think everybody have seen the media reports at this point that shows that different intelligence agencies have very solid evidence that the Assad regime is responsible for using those chemical weapons. The weight of evidence that already exists, not to mention the regime's reluctance until this point to allow the UN inspectors to move freely around the country. Until now, and until this moment, the regime refuses to allow the inspectors to move freely. It monitors them very closely. It allows them to only go to 3 different locations in addition to the last location where chemical weapons were used. It also, in the protocol that is signed with the United Nations, it required the UN to answer one question only, whether chemical weapons were used, but it refuses to allow UN inspectors to answer the more significant questions: who used those chemical weapons? We support the international community's effort to protect Syrian citizens from a murderous regime that thinks that it can gas all of Syrians if it's not stopped. The regime's capacity to carry out such chemical attacks must be stopped. We want the regime to be stopped from using chemical weapons, killing civilians, using other measures, and to be held accountable for all the crimes it has committed. While the UN inspectors were in the Ghouta, the eastern and western Ghouta of Damascus, the regime carried out 2 massacres, one in Aleppo, in Arum, another massacre in Idlib, in Ariha. This is at the same time the regime claims that it's committed to a political solution. At the same time, we've issued a report, a press release yesterday, alerting our international partners, world governments, and different organizations that are concerned with human life to the dire situation of the people who are arrested by the regime. We have hundreds of thousands of people who are sent to jail without trial. The regime is moving them into some military installations that can be targets for any attacks if carried by the world. When the foreign minister of Bashar al-Assad, Mr. Walid Muallim, gave his press conference, he specifically picked and mentioned a couple of cities and neighborhoods in Damascus that are populated by Christians, by Syrian Christians. The Syrian Network for Human Rights issued a press release stating that it has received valid information concerning a pre-planned attempt by the Assad regime to use chemical weapons against those neighborhoods. This is a dangerous, this will be a dangerous step by the Assad regime, and we hope that the world understands the type of criminal who we're dealing with. Yesterday, Mr. al-Ja'fari, the UN ambassador of the Assad regime, held a press conference that was filled with absolute lies, trying to confuse public opinion in the rest of the world. He forgot to mention that the Assad regime is one of the few regimes in the world that continues to have biological and chemical weapons. He forgot to mention that the Assad regime ability to make those chemical weapons, has the willingness to use those chemical weapons as the events have proven. Mr. Al-Jafari also ignored the fact that UN inspectors were not allowed to move out of their hotel for 5 days and during that time, the Assad regime continuously bombarded the areas and shelled the areas where the UN inspectors were supposed to travel to. He also talked about the international treaty for the ban of chemical weapons and mentioned that the US have not signed on that treaty, forgetting that the Assad regime is one of the few regimes in the world that was very forceful and outspoken against signing such treaty. It is very clear to us, even if you put the issue of chemical weapons aside, we have about 2,000 martyrs, fallen heroes, as a result of using chemical weapons in Syria. And we have about 100,000, even 108,000 people who have died as a result of the regime using its ballistic missile capabilities, Scud missiles, air force, tanks. It's very clear that the regime is very well intent on killing all Syrians and doing all it can to remain in control in Syria. There's an overabundance of evidence that this regime is responsible for crimes against humanity and for causing a dire humanitarian circumstance in Syria. And that if the world does not act to stop this regime, there is no alternative, and Assad will continue killing innocent civilians. With that, I'm going to start the Q&A session. سأبدأ بالأسئلة والأجوبة. رجاء أن تعرفوا فقط بأنفسكم والوكالة التي تتبعون لها. I'll do the questions in Arabic and English. I'll do both. So جاوب على الأسئلة بالعربي والإنجليزي حتى أسهل الموضوع. محمد شيخ يوسف من وكالة تنظيم الأنباء. تحدثتم أن الائتلاف جمع أدلة من الأرض تقديمها إلى اللجان المختصة. واليوم أعلن أن اللجنة الأممية ستغادر سوريا يوم السبت المقبل. هل لديكم أو تكشفون لنا عن طبيعة هذه الأدلة وكيف سيتم تسليمها إلى اللجنة بعد أن تغادر سوريا أو أثناء وجودها داخل سوريا؟ الأدلة التي جمعها الائتلاف الوطني السوري جمعت مباشرة وبالتعاون مع المكتب الطبي الموحد في الغوطة. الهدف منها لأننا لم نكن واثقين أن اللجنة الأممية ستتمكن من الوصول إلى الأماكن التي ضربت بالسلاح الكيماوي في الغوطتين الشرقية والغربية. هذه الأدلة نقلت إلى خارج سوريا، هي الآن موجودة في إحدى دول الجوار، لكن نظرا لكون اللجنة الأممية وصلت وتمكنت من جمع الأدلة، فأدلتنا هذه ستوضع جانبا حاليا. هي متوفرة والحكومات المختلفة تم إخطارها بوجود هذه الأدلة. نحن نأمل أننا لن نحتاج استخدام هذه الأدلة لأن المفتشين قضوا ساعات كثيرة حقيقة في مناطق الغوطة الشرقية والغربية، وجمعوا حسب تواصلنا مع الناشطين في الداخل مع أعضاء الائتلاف الوطني السوري المتواجدين أيضا في ريف دمشق. قالوا لنا أن المفتشين جمعوا الكثير من الأدلة ولديهم ما يكفي لإثبات استخدام السلاح الكيماوي، وأيضا إذا رغبوا من الذي استخدم السلاح الكيماوي. The question was about the evidence that the Syrian coalition have collected and what was done with them. From the first few hours that the regime used chemical weapons against innocent civilians, we've communicated with Syrian coalition members who live in the countryside of Damascus. We have co members who live there. We've communicated with the office, the Medical Relief Office of Ghouta, the United Medical Relief Office of Ghouta, and this is the office that looks over all the medical efforts, medical first responders in Ghouta. And we've asked them to collect samples according to international standards. Those samples were sent outside of Syria to our contacts in neighboring countries. We have those samples. However, since the UN inspectors were able to go into Ghouta, they spent enough hours in Ghouta. Our contacts there, some of the Syrian coalition members were actually with them as they were moving from one city to the next. We believe that the UN inspectors have enough evidence, enough samples to show a couple of things. One, whether chemical weapons were used, and secondly, who used those chemical weapons. And we hope to see those questions answered in the very near future.
Where did you send the samples, and who's processing them? Because AFAD have said that they're not, but that they have, arrived.
Who said that?
AFAD, I forgot the acronym. But
Okay. We've sent them. What I can say is that we've sent them to a neighboring country. I don't want to mention the country, and we've actually talked to several organizations to ensure that these samples were collected according to international standards. So if different governments want to use them, they are available. However, like I mentioned, since the UN inspectors are there, they've collected enough samples. We don't see a need to use our samples, and nonetheless, they are available in actually a couple of neighboring countries.
Barack Obama said that the military intervention won't aim to change the regime. What do you think about that?
Mr. Obama spoke very, very clearly. The Assad regime committed a crime against humanity by using chemical weapons. We're talking about the use of chemical weapons in the 21st century. Chemical weapons were banned in 1925. Long time ago. No one would have imagined that chemical weapons would be used in this day and age. The Assad regime must be punished for its use of chemical weapons. We understand that. We understand that the international community must act to respond to the use of chemical weapons. We're not. We understand that the strikes, if the decision is made, to carry them out, because President Obama was very clear in his speech. He is yet to make that decision, and we understand that fully. It is not going to be about bringing change to the regime. It is going to be about stopping the use of chemical weapons again, and that's something that we understand. We believe it's a step in the right direction. لعلي أجاوب على هذا السؤال فقط باللغة العربية أولا. السؤال كان أن الرئيس الأمريكي السيد باراك أوباما تحدث البارحة وقال أن الضربة إذا تقرر استخدام الحل العسكري فهو لن يكون لتغيير النظام. السيد أوباما تحدث بشكل واضح وصريح. حتى هذه اللحظة هو لم يتخذ القرار باستخدام الحل العسكري، وهو ينظر في عدد من الحلول المطروحة أمامه بغض النظر عما تداولته وسائل الإعلام. بعض وسائل الإعلام ذكرت أن الضربة ستكون البارحة أو حتى اليوم. الواقع غير ذلك، وهذا الأمر أنا ذكرته للعديد من وسائل الإعلام التي تحدثت معها. نحن نتفهم الموقف الدولي. هذه الضربة لن تكون لتغيير النظام. هذه الضربة ستكون وبشكل واضح لمنع النظام من استخدام السلاح الكيماوي مرة أخرى. نحن نتحدث عن سلاح تم حظره دوليا في عام 1925، والآن وفي القرن ال21 يقوم نظام الأسد باستخدامه. لا يمكن للمجتمع الدولي أن يسمح بحصول جرائم ضد الإنسانية كالتي ارتكبها نظام بشار الأسد وأن تمر هذه الجرائم من دون عقاب.
أحمد زكريا مراسل راديو الكوري. بما أن تم التأكد من استخدام السلاح الكيميائي من قبل نظام الأسد، هل تم الطلب من أمريكا والغرب بإدراج اسم الأسد على لائحة المطلوبين للمحاكمة الدولية في لاهاي فورا؟ أيضا ما هو الإجراء الذي تم اتخاذه من أجل حماية المعتقلين؟ ولكم جزيل الشكر.
من ناحية التعامل مع مسألة استخدام السلاح الكيماوي، نحن نمر بعدة مراحل في هذا الشأن. تم التثبيت والتأكد من استخدام نظام الأسد للسلاح الكيماوي، لكن هذا من طرفنا ومن طرف استخبارات بعض الدول. نحن ننتظر الآن تقرير لجنة الأمم المتحدة، ومع ذلك ومنذ اللحظات الأولى لاستخدام الأسد السلاح الكيماوي كان لنا حديث واضح وصريح مع ما يسمى مجموعة لندن، وهي المجموعة الرئيسية في مجموعة أصدقاء سوريا. قلنا لهم أن نظام بشار الأسد تجاوز الخط الأحمر الذي وضعه الرئيس أوباما، تركه خلفه بأميال، وأن هذا الرد الجريء، أن هذا الإجرام الجريء من قبل بشار الأسد يتطلب ردا جريئا وقويا من طرف المجتمع الدولي. مطلبنا واضح وبشكل صريح، لم نتطرق إلى تفاصيل المطلب. احموا السوريين من استخدام السلاح الكيماوي مرة أخرى، عاقبوا المسؤولين عن استخدام السلاح الكيماوي. الدول المختلفة الآن تبحث عن الصيغة المناسبة، عن الزمان والمكانين المناسبين. من ناحية المعتقلين في أقبية سجون الأسد، لدينا قوائم تم تسليم هذه القوائم للمنظمات المختلفة، للحكومات المختلفة. للأسف أنت أيضا تتعامل مع نظام مجرم، يعني حتى أقرب الشركاء لبشار الأسد تخلوا عنه، لأنه لم يكف عن أن معهم في الكثير من الإحراجات. الروس، الصينيون، حتى الإيرانيون، وإن كانوا يتحدثون بغير ذلك عن الإعلام، أحرجهم نظام الأسد لأنهم لم يكونوا يتوقعوا أن يقوم باستخدام السلاح الكيماوي على هذا النطاق الواسع. لكن هذا معناه أن هذا النظام لا يستجيب للضغط السياسي، هذا النظام لا يأبه للعملية السياسية، لا يأبه لأبسط حقوق الإنسان، لا يأبه للمجتمع الدولي، وهذه هي المشكلة الحقيقية التي يقع فيها السوريون. Let me just comment quickly about this and translate this in terms of the demands that we've made to the international community. Last Monday, there was a meeting for the Core 11, or what's called the London group of the Friends of Syria. The meeting was attended by the Presidential Committee of the Syrian Coalition. It was also attended at the diplomatic level by ambassadors from the different 11 countries. What we've told the countries attending the meeting, that is very clear that the Assad regime have taken a very bold step by using chemical weapons against innocent civilians. We all know that he has used those chemical weapons. He has crossed that red line, left it behind him a few miles back. And this very bold step by the Assad regime requires a very bold response from the international community. What we're asking for first, to bring those who committed this crime against Syrians to justice. Number two, who committed this crime against Syrians to justice. Number two, to protect Syrians from Assad's capabilities of using chemical weapons against Syrians again. We did not get into details. And let me repeat this. We've made many demands in the past. The international community knows our position. But at this point, we're not making any specific demands. We've said, you need to protect innocent civilians. Show us what you can do, and that's what we are following up with the different countries to do at this point.
Thank you. It is reported that the U.S. attack may be very limited just by sending a warning to the Assad regime. So is it enough for you? And on the other hand, once that kind of Western attack started, don't you feel any concern of the retaliation by the Assad regime? Just a kind of Western attack may give the Assad a pretext to suppress the innocent people. So, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the options that President Obama is considering a limited response to the international community, and he made a limited response to the Assad regime. He had made that very clear. Ultimately, the response, and as President Obama had made it very clear, is not about to bring regime change, as we mentioned in a different question. We understand that. And what we are asking for, again, at this point in time, from this response, is to protect innocent civilians, protect Syrians, because if the international community does not act right now, you can expect for sure that Assad will see that as a green light to commit even more crimes against Syrians. Remember, the very first attacks that the Assad regime carried against innocent civilians in Syria, we've had anywhere between 20 to about 100 people, 100 casualties. Now we're talking about 1,360 casualties. If the world does not send Assad a very clear message that he cannot continue using chemical weapons, you can expect Assad to escalate his attacks. We have a grave worry. We understand that the Assad regime has no ability to respond to any move if the international community decides to carry out strikes against Assad, even if they are limited. Assad has limited military capability, limited intelligence capability outside, which means that the Assad response is going to be directed against innocent Syrians. He's going to have more crimes against Syrians, and that's something that we are very worried about. That's something that we've mentioned to our international partners as well. من ناحية السؤال كان عن الضربة المتوقعة أنها ستكون ضربة محدودة. نحن ذكرنا لمجموعة أصدقاء الشعب السوري أننا مدركون أن هذه الضربة وحسب ما وصلنا من معلومات إذا تم القرار بالقيام بها هي ستكون ضربة محدودة لن تهدف إلى تغيير النظام. ما نركز عليه في هذه المرحلة إذا قام المجتمع الدولي بالتحرك وهو المطلوب منه، أولا عليهم أن يمنعوا الأسد من استخدام السلاح الكيماوي مرة أخرى. عدم الرد على نظام بشار الأسد في هذه المرحلة يعني إعطائه الضوء الأخضر لكي يرتكب المزيد من الجرائم ضد السوريين. قدرة نظام الأسد العسكرية، قدرة نظام الأسد الاستخباراتية على الرد على أي ضربة دولية شبه معدومة، وجميعنا ندرك ذلك. هذا يعني أن النظام سيزداد وحشية ضد المدنيين العزل داخل سوريا. هذا أمر يقلقنا بشدة، وهو أمر ذكرناه أيضا لأصدقاء الشعب السوري.
On Monday's meeting, what intelligence did you share with the representatives of 11 countries? Do you have a satellite image or something else? And my second question is, did you talk about the targets to strike in the Monday's meeting? Did you have any requests, any demand, or did they share about this?
The Monday meeting that we've held was a diplomatic level meeting with the foreign ministries. We don't typically discuss military questions during these meetings because you're meeting with foreign ministers or diplomats, so they don't get involved in military details. However, we did release during that meeting a very detailed outline based on the intelligence reports that we've received, the specific timeline, the specific brigades that were responsible for loading the chemical weapons, for launching the chemical weapons. This intelligence report was released to media yesterday in both Arabic and English, so it should be available, or somebody from the media office can make that available to you. And this is something is being closely examined by different countries because it's yet another way to prove that the Assad regime had committed those massacres. We did not discuss specific targets during those. I know there are some media reports that there were targets discussed. We did not discuss any targets during those meetings. There was a lot of discussion that, let me kind of address that. What the discussion was about. The meeting is only about 3 hours. It's not a full day meeting, but there is a lot of focus that yes, they've agreed that the Assad regime have committed crimes using chemical weapons, and it's a crime against humanity. We're talking about how do we actually prove that, so it will become generally accepted to everybody that truly the Assad regime, because we have enough intelligence, our partners have enough intelligence, but how do we actually ensure that this is a very important decision for the rest of the world to make. So how you are 100% certain or 99% certain, it's impossible to reach 100% certainty, that the Assad regime was responsible for the use of chemical weapons. And what we've communicated to them is you need to respond, and there was an agreement that such act by Assad cannot go unpunished. There was discussion about, after we go through this process, about the international response, whatever it might be, what is next? Because ultimately we want to stop the bloodshed in Syria. No one is interested in continuing to see hundreds of Syrians getting killed every day. We continued our commitment to a political solution. This is something that we've made very clear. We are committed to a political solution, but a regime that uses chemical weapons, a regime that after the use of chemical weapons, and while the UN inspectors are there, continues to shell eastern and western Ghouta, a regime that commits 2 massacres on the same day that the inspectors are going to Ghouta, it's a regime that's not serious about political solution. We hear what Assad says, but also we see what he does.
I think that it's told you to prepare about the conference for Geneva, right?
There was some discussion around the conference of Geneva. For us, again, we're going back to the point where we are committed to a political solution. This is something not off the table. However, before, let me kind of be very clear on this. We've said we are committed to a political solution, be it Geneva or not. But before we can talk about Geneva, we need to see the world's response. It is very difficult. Our first constituency is Syrians inside. It's very difficult for me to look at the mother who just lost her children or the father who lost his family and tell him, you know what, I'm going to sit on the table with the guy who just killed your children. We want the world to respond. We understand that at the end, every conflict that you have in the world ends up with people sitting on the table. Look at World War I, World War II. You end up sitting on the table, but you have to have the right circumstances. You have to have goodwill gestures from both sides. And we are willing to do whatever it takes to stop the bloodshed. We just need to have a serious effort from the Assad's regime, which we have not seen yet.
مرحبا، أنا إيليا توبر، مراسل الوكالة الإسبانية FM. هناك سؤال. هذا المساء هناك مجتمعات في الحكومة التركية بين السيد أردوغان وجول أرمادون والأشخاص من الجهات الأمنية. هل هناك ممثل من الائتلاف الوطني سوف يشارك في هذا المجتمع؟ وعلى أي حال ما هو التفاهم والمناقشة الآن بين الائتلاف والحكومة التركية وماذا يريد الائتلاف أن يفعل تركيا؟ هل هناك طلب من جهة الائتلاف لتركيا كي يأخذ أي فترة؟ شكرا.
من ناحية الاجتماع، هذه حقيقة أول مرة أسمع باجتماع، لن يكون هناك ممثل عادة في الاجتماعات الأمنية على هذا المستوى، لا يحضر ممثل من الائتلاف هذه الاجتماعات، هذا أولا. مطلوبنا من الحكومة التركية هو مثل المطلب الذي قدمناه لبقية الدول وخاصة ما يسمى بمجموعة لندن، الدول ال11، وهي الدول الداعمة للثورة منذ الأيام الأولى، لم يكن هنالك طلب خاص. يعني أنا أستطيع باعتبار أننا موجودون في تركيا، أستطيع أن أعلق أن ما قدمه الشعب التركي أولا وما قدمته الحكومة التركية في دعم الثورة السورية وفي دعم السوريين يفوق الوصف. حقيقة وقفوا إلى جانبنا من مستوى من الأخوة لم نكن يعني نحن به، ولذلك نحن شاكرون لكل ما تقدمه هذه الحكومة، لكل ما يقدمه الشعب التركي، لكن لم يكن هناك مطالب خاصة إضافية من الحكومة التركية. Sure. There's a security meeting that's being held between Mr. Erdogan and some of his security advisors later today, and the question was whether we are going to attend these. This is the first time I hear of the meeting, and I'm usually kept aware of these meetings. We don't typically attend these meetings; they're done at the Turkish government. But also, we did not make any specific demands to the Turkish government. We've made our requests, the one I mentioned, to the Core 11, to the London group. The Turkish government is one of those countries. The Turkish people and the Turkish government have supported the Syrian people, the Syrian revolution from the very first days. They've gone above and beyond, and one must be grateful for all that they have done.
Are you seeing any signs that the Syrian government is moving potential targets into civilian areas or taking preparations for an attack that would concern you?
We have seen some reports about the government, the Assad government, moving some of its military units to different locations, some to civilian areas. I've seen some of those reports. What I can say that we cannot confirm these reports at this point, but it's something to be expected. What's more interesting is the number of defections that took place in the last 3 to 4 days. This is something that we can actually confirm. We're going to be issuing press statements about that, because last night we've managed to confirm a large number of defections from some high-ranking officers who have decided to remove their military clothes and put on civilian clothes and travel outside the country. There are plenty of those now in Lebanon. There are some of them who are traveling to other Arab countries, but we can confirm this and we'll be issuing a statement about that. What's important at this point, I mean, those officers serving in the Assad regime's army, they can see where this is going. I know a decision has not been made yet, but now they understand that if a decision is made, they will be putting their lives at risk, and they have to make that decision, whether they want to continue and lose their life or whether they want to abandon the Assad army and leave. We know the number of defections have slowed down because many of them defected from the Assad regime. An army that was 300,000 at some point has about 70,000 fighters, and the latest estimate that we have anywhere between 70 to 80. What's important is after the latest news is that we hear about more defections. And from here, we're going to be issuing a statement to those officers serving in the Assad army, asking them to put their weapons down, to go to their families. There is no need to risk their lives to protect a regime that will go away eventually. We understand that it's just a matter of time. تعليق لعلي اجاوب بس بالترجمه هذا العربيه لانه امر هام. من ناحيه قيام نظام الاسد بنقل بعض القطاعات العسكريه من اماكنها، نقلها الى مناطق يتواجد فيها المدنيين الامنين. شاهدنا بعض التقارير عن قيام نظام الاسد بذلك، هذه التقارير حتى الان غير مؤكده. ما نستطيع ان نؤكده وهو امر مهم هو قيام عدد جيد لا باس به من ضباط الجيش الاسدي بخلع اللباس العسكري والتحول الى مدنيين ومغادره البلد. هنالك عدد من هؤلاء الضباط الذين غادروا الى لبنان، كما ان هنالك عدد قاموا بنقل عائلاتهم الى لبنان وبعض البلدان العربيه الاخرى. في النهايه الضباط والذين ما يزالوا حتى هذه اللحظه يقاتلون في جيش الاسد عليهم ان يختاروا اذا كانوا يريدون ان يضحوا بحياتهم ليحموا هذا النظام الزائل، والذي جميعنا يدرك في هذه المرحله انه المساله مساله وقت قبل أن تنتصر الثورة وقبل أن يقاد الأسد إلى محكمة عادلة. خطابنا إلى هؤلاء الضباط: عليكم أن تفكروا بشكل جدي، عليكم آن الأوان أن تلقوا سلاحكم وتذهبوا إلى بيوتكم، وإلا فإنكم ستواجهون المصير الذي واجهه الكثيرون الذين أصروا على حماية نظام الأسد. خطابنا أيضا إلى أمهات وزوجات الضباط الذين ما زالوا حتى هذه اللحظة يقاتلون ضمن جيش الأسد: اتصلوا بأبنائكم، اتصلوا بأزواجكم، اطلبوا منهم أن يلقوا السلاح. ليس من مبرر أن يخسروا حياتهم في حماية نظام زائل.
ممكن تقول الأرقام؟
الأرقام نعم، حتى الجيش الأسدي في بداية الثورة كان حوالي 300,000 بين 300 إلى 350. التقديرات الاستخباراتية الآن تتحدث أن جيش الأسد يتراوح بين 70 إلى 80,000 فقط. يعني تم تحديد قسم ضخم من جيش الأسد حتى هذه المرحلة، وهذا هو السبب أنه يعتمد على ميليشيات حزب الله وبعض الميليشيات الإيرانية والعراقية.
Thank you very much. And my third question is why? Can you explain why you don't demand the Western countries to military intervention for aiming for the regime change?
What we want, what's important for us, is to do a couple of things: to stop the bloodshed in Syria. That's a top priority for us. But also, it's very critical for us to bring to justice those who are responsible for killing the crimes. Now, we are working, we have our own efforts. We have the Free Syrian Army that's advancing. We talked in the last press conference, sorry, the one before, that the Free Syrian Army advanced and had over 63 strategic victories on the ground. We believe that we're advancing on daily basis. The reports in the last 3-4 days show that the FSA continues to advance even in light of the use of chemical weapons. We're also continuing the political process. We talked about the political solution, our commitment to that political solution. Now, the decision to deal with Bashar al-Assad is an international decision. Chemical weapons were used, a crime against humanity has been used, a crime against humanity was committed, and we want to see what the world response will be to that crime. We're not going to get into specifics. We've asked for many, many specific things over the last 2.5 years. The international community understands what it needs to do. Ultimately, the way we will judge what happens is by those two parameters that I put. Are Syrians going to be able to sleep at night without being afraid for their lives? And are we bringing Bashar to justice?
And you have said 1,360 people were killed in the chemical attack. And how many soldiers, Syrian freedom soldiers were killed among
those, the breakdown?
Yes. And how many freedom soldiers are fighting inside Syria now? And how many percent of the land now you have an opposition have hold?
Very good.
And also, if the military intervention by the West will change the balance on the battlefield front.
Very good. So of the 1,360, we know that over half of them were women and children. Of the 1,360, there are rough estimates that about 20% of those who were killed were actual FSA, Free Syrian Army soldiers. Remember that the Assad regime had a very coordinated attack. About an hour after the use of chemical weapons, the Assad regime pushed into specific areas. And for the first 4 to 5 hours, it managed to capture certain neighborhoods that were under the control of the FSA after the use of chemical weapons. However, I was talking to one of the commanders late night, early morning today, and in the last 5 days, the FSA was able to push the Assad regime back to the early points that, to the earlier points that they were holding prior to the chemical attacks. In terms of the number of the FSA is anywhere between 90 to 100,000 fighters. The challenge is not in the numbers. The challenge for the FSA is the fact that they are heavily under-equipped compared to what the Assad regime has. Remember, the Assad regime continues to receive arms shipments from Russia on a weekly basis, anywhere between 2 to 4 shipments per week. This is something, these are weapons that are being used to kill Syrians. And we've made continuous demands from the international community to put pressure on Russia to stop providing this regime with more weapons to kill Syrians. I'm going to take the last question. آخر سؤال إذا في حد عنده. Again. Here you go.
Oh, it was really small one, but you said that prisoners of conscience were being moved into areas that are likely to be bombed. What evidence is there for that? And there's unconfirmed reports as well.
We actually have fairly good contact with, we have very good contact with some of these prisoners inside some of these jails. We keep on getting reports. We've had one reporter that cooperated with the media office, was arrested and in Deir ez-Zor, and I got a phone call from him. So I thought I was very happy, and I thought he was released. And he told me no, he was still at that point in time still a prisoner in Aleppo. He actually bribed the guards to get him a cell phone. So he called us to say, well, you know, he still had some equipment for the media office that needs to be destroyed. So the situation over there is not as strict. We are very aware there are some well-known prisoners that we keep track of as they move from one area to the next. And we're very worried about those guys, especially well-known personalities. I want to remind you also there is Mr. Abdulaziz Al-Khair. He is from Hayat Tansir. He's been arrested now, disappeared for the past 13, 14 months. There are unconfirmed reports that he died. We're trying through our contacts to find where he is, what his whereabouts. But he's the kind of person that the regime will not let anybody have access to, so extremely difficult to know. So the upper class and those who are movers and shakers, those are kept very closely. But when you have 200 to 300,000 prisoners, ultimately you will find out information about their movements.
But are you able to release sort of where they were moved to? Oh, sorry, you just said an example.
Yeah, I mean they're getting moved from one area to the next. Some we know that were moved to some of the military installations that could be a target targeted. So we're worried about that. Okay. Well, thank you for attending. شكرا لحضوركم المؤتمر الصحفي. حتى الآن لم نقرر إذا سيكون هنالك مؤتمر صحفي يومي، يعني نحن بانتظار التطورات، الوضع يتغير بشكل سريع، نحاول متابعة الوضع وسنعلمكم بآخر التفاصيل. As you see, the situation is very fluid, so we're going to try and keep you aware of the latest information. We're still not decided on the frequency of this press conference. At this point, we're holding it on a weekly basis, but we've got an overwhelming number of requests in the last couple of days. So if we see that this continues, we might be holding this press conference at a more regular interval. Thank you for coming.